Sup, everybody? All right. Another thing I wanted to get onto is pro and amateur. I think the especially in South Australia, there is no real pro and amateur thing going on. You just pro because you fight 5-3s, not through any particular. There's no particular transition or anything. But I'd also notice Australia. I'm not sure of any other country that actually counts all their amateur fights in their pro record. Like someone who's had 30 fights from, say, I don't know. For instance, look at Savas Michael, who fights on one out of Pet Yindi in Thailand. He's had about 30 fights, but amateur career of 109. So this is where things need to change, I think, in Australia. Like, have your amateur career, and when you think it's time to go pro, then you go pro. The thing is, then you start your career, you start your count all over again. It's no different to going pro in boxing. There's no secrets. The thing is, once you go pro, then you fight another guy who's having his pro debut, or he's had 2 or 3 pro fights. Whatever you feel like. If you're confident in your guy, then you put him in against someone who's had a few extras. But I think there needs to be that that divide between amateur and pro. Like the development days, like PTJ actually got on today, really great. And so we need to start making those days fully padded events here in South Australia as well. And then the big difference is, like, even in New South Wales, you go pro, you still count those, 8 amateur fights or whatever you had, fully padded fights in your record. I think they have to have a certain number of fights with headgear and shin guards, and once they have the head scanned, then they no longer have that, and you're registered as a pro. But there's no real change in anything, and the career fight count just keeps on going up, and that's hard when you take on the rest of the world in the pros, and you're getting matched against a guy who's had 30 pro fights, and you've had 30 fights. You've actually only had 30 fights, including your amateurs. They've had 30 pro, including their 300 amateurs. Good example would be my good friend Mustafa Abdullahi. He's originally Iranian, now living in Australia. I do believe his amateur record is somewhere around 330. Correct me if I'm wrong, 331 amateurs. And then in the pros, I think he might have had 60 or 70 pro fights. But there was you don't mention all the amateur stuff when you're fighting as a pro. Like, there's no need for it. You use the amateurs to develop, then you start from zero again. So it doesn't matter. Then you lose all this bullshit in the early days of having to have a perfect record. So when you go pro, you've got a perfect record. And your record continues and it stays really good or whatever. You're better off having your amateurs, so it doesn't matter. The wins and losses don't fucking matter at all. Not that they do anyway, but to all the egotistical people out there, they do. But if you can fight as an amateur, you lose your first 20 amateur fights. Who gives a shit? Because then you might have, say that you might win your next 10. You have 30 amateur fights, you decide it's time to go pro, or your trainer decides it's time to go pro, so you go pro, then you start from zero again. Then you show who you really are, and you start a real record, which is the record that matters for the rest of time. The amateur record shouldn't matter at all. I know there's going to be, that's unfair bullshit, but Australia's the only place I know of that does it. Correct me if I'm wrong, if you're from another country and you're watching this and you do the same thing as what Australia does. So my first fight was headgear, shin guards. Then I had another headgear, shin guards fight. Then I went and fought in Darwin where there was no headgear, shin guards. Then I came back, headgear, shin guards again. Then I went to Thailand, started fighting. Then I came back, I fought 3-2s again. The only fights and at the time I didn't understand how Australia went, because I was training with people like Arslan Magomedov and then in Bangkok, and they were like, I've had 20 fights. I was like, how does that work? They're like, I had like 180 in Russia, amateurs. Like, oh, right. So then it starts making sense. So then I started doing the same thing, and people started bitching about me, and I didn't realise in Australia we didn't do it like that, because I got my education about the record thing in Thailand through the Middle Eastern guys, Eastern European guys, not Middle Eastern, the Eastern European guys, and through going to the World Amateurs and stuff and finding out these guys were having 300 amateur fights and then going pro. I'd really love to see something like that happen in Australia, where once you go pro, your record starts again. It'll stop a lot of the bragging that goes on as well. But yeah, get rid of this amateur record. Let you guys have all their losses in their amateur to get ready to go pro. It works in the boxing, and it works really well. It's how it's always been. No one goes pro and they go, oh, how many amateurs did they have? It doesn't matter. They've gone pro. Once you're going for your pro debut, if you're fighting someone who's had 1 pro fight, 2 pro fights, no pro fights, whatever, you're on even playing field. You're starting fresh. So just for some food for thought. We're probably a long way off it ever happening, because first of all, the states have all got to start agreeing on something, and there being something level across the board. We've got South Australia, where we have our head scans before we can fight without a headgear. Other states just have the register for amateur, register for pro. We have that here, but it doesn't really get used. Amateurs can fight pros and whatever. Queensland, anything goes. Northern Territory, I can't remember how that goes. I think WA's got the amateur and pro thing going with the headgear, no headgear. All juniors must wear protection and stuff. But yeah, we've got to try and find that way. So we have the guys that are in IFMA. It's a different style. So amateur and pro are 2 different styles, really. So the IFMA style is a lot more, sort of scoring compared to the pro, with bum, bum, bum sort of stuff. A good bit of education on that would be Size podcast he did with Spring Seer. They were talking about her just going into the amateur stuff. It doesn't matter if you're pro and competing in IFMA. That can happen. It shouldn't matter how many fights you've had as a pro, whether it affects your amateur, because they're 2 different styles anyway. That's probably the only difference, I think, between the pro boxing and pro Muay Thai. Going back to fight in amateurs is possible in Muay Thai, because it is a different game, and even though it is in boxing as well, it's a different game, but there's less numbers in it in our sport compared to boxing to be able to do the whole, all right, once I've signed away from amateurs, I can't go back to it. You shouldn't be able to fight on the local scene as an amateur anymore once you've gone pro, but on the world scene, you should be able to go into the amateurs. Please, give me some feedback on this one. I'm very interested to see what people think. The educated people, anyway, because a lot of people love to give their opinion but don't actually understand it. They're actually not deep enough in the game for it to matter. I'd like to see what people like Don Miller, Andy Parnham, Blair Smith, Darren Reese have to say about it. They're some of the big Muay Thai trainers, the Muay Thai stylist trainers in Australia. If anyone wants to tag them in it, that'd be great. But yeah, let's see, if people can start getting a little bit less stressed about their records, because they want to build up to be a pro and then go pro and then start worrying about it. Even if we just start with restarting the records once people register as a pro, that might be a good little start. And then from there, we can work on building up the amateurs to be able to have them having amateur weekends where you can have 2 or 3 fights in a weekend, and you build up your record as an amateur. So just so it gets wiped when you go pro. It's a good idea in my books. Shoot me some feedback on this one, please, everyone. Until then, peace out.